In the upcoming election, Tazewell County voters will have the chance to decide whether or not they want to have an auditor position. And joining me now to talk about that is the County Board Chairman, Dave Zimmerman. So you all, as far as the board, you decided to place this referendum onto the upcoming ballot for voters to decide whether or not they want to have the traditional auditor position.
Correct.
You have now thought about some things that could happen if voters say yes to your proposal.
Correct.
What are the options if you do decide to get rid of that position? Because you can't not have an auditor at all. So what's the thought
So just a
process?
quick background first. You know, we have to, by state statute, do an external audit every year. So we are audited. And also 85 counties and 1,300 municipalities in the state of Illinois do not have an elected auditor. Because of the statute, we need to have one unless we eliminate it by referendum.
Because you meet the people threshold, you have to
75,000.
have an elected
Exactly.
auditor position because it's more than 70,000 people who are in Tazewell County.
Right. So anyway, we have several options, and we have a couple of years to really decide what is the best option if the voters ultimately say, no, we want a professional hired auditor versus an elected auditor.
And that's because the current auditor, Shelley Ranka, her term doesn't end until 2020.
Right. 2020 is when her term expires. So a couple of the options that we have right off the bat is we could hire an outside firm that actually specializes in auditing. And so we would have the utmost in professionalism looking over our books. They wouldn't need to be there full time. They could come in periodically and do spot checks with departments. Another option that we might have is to hire somebody part-time, maybe a retired CPA that would come in and again look at the bills, do spot checks and audits in the different departments, and we may be able to use our current existing staff that we have.
Now, oftentimes when boards are talking about eliminating positions, it's cost saving.
Correct.
It doesn't sound like there would be a lot of cost saving necessarily here when you're looking at potentially eliminating the current status of the position, because you still have to bring in professional people to do that role, which I would imagine they wouldn't take the same amount of money as, say, maybe an elected person currently is. They probably would demand more. So what is the exact reasoning behind wanting to get rid of this traditional setting of the auditor position?
Well, if they were full-time, obviously we would pay more. Right now the auditor has a budget of about $70,000, and that includes her salary. So we would have that money to use that. Beyond the money savings, and we would see savings, we would bring, again, we could guarantee a certain degree of professionalism, credentialed individual in that office, and that's nothing against our current auditor or past auditors. It's just that we could guarantee that we would have the most up-to-date, well-trained professional looking at our books.
And you mentioned having part-time positions there. So two things, kind of a double question in there, just from an outsider's perspective looking in. One, is it a good idea for someone who is not elected but chosen by the board to audit the board? I'm sure there are voters who have that question. And then also to have someone who would be part-time. I know that right now there's a part-time auditor, well, there's an interim auditor within the Peoria County situation. But with larger counties in particular, is that effective to have someone who is not exactly full staffed in for that particular position to audit the county's finances?
Well, to your first point, independence is very important to us. In the committee that looked at that, that was one of their main points of interest that they really studied. And so whoever we would do this, if it was an internal employee, they would answer to an independent committee consisting of maybe somebody from the state's attorney's office, somebody from the community, so they would be completely independent from the board. I mean, ultimately, we would have the authority to fire. But in terms, if it's a part-time position, then a part-time position would be a good thing. I guess one of my biggest arguments is that we have a $60 million budget. So I can't think of any business that would be a $60 million business that would not use certain criteria to select who's going to be auditing their books. And that's what we want to do in Tazewell County, is we want to ensure that there are certain credentials, training, certifications in order to be the most up-to-date in looking at our books.
All right, just two more questions for you, because I'm not quite sure exactly how this would go, but why not in that case? I know Peoria County tried this, and I don't know if, I guess one had to go with the other actually.
Right.
But is it not possible to add credentials to an elected office? Is that just not possible in and of itself?
You know, it could, but it may take 3 or 4 years, and that individual is in that office looking at our books for 3 or 4 years. I think one other option as we're talking here is that we might even look into intergovernmental agreements where is there any reason that Peoria and McLean and Tazewell couldn't share the same auditor? They'd be familiar with county government and know how things are done. We're open to looking at anything over the next couple of years.
And my last question, I don't know how much you can share about this, but I know there is an actual lawsuit right now from the current auditor onto the board about how she states that the board has handled the office in and of itself and shrinking and taking away resources. Is there any comment that you could say on the update of that?
You know, only that we have resources in her budget that she's not used yet. And so when she uses those resources and still doesn't have time to do her job, we're more than willing to listen to anything that she'd like to bring forward to us.
All right. Well, I'm sure she'll have comments to say about that, I'm sure
great,
as well.
yeah.
But as always, Dave Zimmerman, Tazewell County Board Chairman, thanks for coming on and talking about this.
Thank you for the invitation.
That will be on the next election in November.
The November
voters will
ballot,
have the choice on whether or not to keep the current auditor position as it is or to give the board the right to change it.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely.